Thank you so much for inspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Andrea, and thank you all for being here and for tolerating English, and I appreciate that very much. I have about 100 images, so it's the opposite style of presentation entirely, which is great, I think. And there's so many overlapping ideas here that's really fascinating. The programming is really spot on in terms of Dr. Rita and I in dialogue with one another. I'm just going to briefly introduce Visual Studies Workshop as a place. We're in Rochester, New York, which is about 500 kilometers from New York City, so it's not that close to New York. All of our activities take place in this building. You see, we call this the castle. It's nothing like castles here in Prague, but it is a very large, old, stately building in the States. Rochester is significant because it was where George Eastman created the Kodak company, and then Xerox developed out of that research and development, as well as Bausch & Lomb. So Bausch & Lomb is in optics and lenses. Xerox obviously is electrostatic imaging, film and production of imaging, with Kodak obviously as well. Sorry, the view just switched on me, so I'm just kind of reconnecting here. Visual Studies Workshop started in 1969. It's actually a direct lineage of the Bauhaus. Moholy-Nagy was teaching in Chicago, and John Wood got out of World War II as a pilot, and then took GI Bill study with Moholy-Nagy at the new Bauhaus, and then he went and taught Nathan Lyons and Joan Lyons, who founded Visual Studies Workshop. A lot of the kind of activities, educationally, pedagogically, are in essence in lineage with that, although there's some differences. This is our 50th anniversary. We're in this kind of mode of looking back a bit. We do consider ourselves an alternative education program in a lot of ways, which is interesting. I'd love to have some more conversation about that because you opened my mind, Dr. Rita, to some of those ideas of difference. Largely came out of workshops in curatorial practice and photography, and it's a very humanistic approach. All the visual studies activities are connected to other fields in the humanities in most cases, and the sciences. So the idea is that as many possible people will engage with the form of visual practice, and this will include all different disciplines: anthropology, environmental science, public history, and so forth. This is just a snapshot of our front page of our website by way of talking a little bit about some of the programmatic activity at VSW. There is a Master of Fine Arts study program that is state education connected with State University of New York. There's currently 14 students in that official discipline. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought that I had images moving along here.
It doesn't work.
It just kind of...
Oh my god, it got stuck? I really don't know why.
Sorry, we'll just... there's a 100% failure rate with all technology in education and exhibition practice, usually. It's totally frozen.
Yeah, it's frozen. Yeah.
Is there a battery issue? Oh, there we go. What'd you do there? Oh.
Does it work now? No. Yeah, so
Good? Okay. Yeah. That's the humanistic approach slide. So it makes a little more relevance, I think. This is the front page of the website slide. A little different. Again, the Master of Fine Arts program, upper left image, has about 14. It has exactly 14 students in it at the moment. There's also a community education program, and we educate dozens of people through workshops and free programs, including experimental film series, monthly artist talks, and curator lectures and visiting artist lectures. Part of that is out of a residency program. Andrea mentioned that before. She and Tomasz Herza were residents last year, and we have about 25 residents, international, national, state, wide coming every year. There's one regionally based and one national and internationally based resident at a time. They usually engage with one another, share ideas, also with all these students that are there. It's a small place, Rochester, so you get connected to other institutions while there as well. There's a massive collection of images, about 1 million images and about 50,000 books, all in visual cultural studies for researchers and for people to engage in visual research. Andrea asked me to talk about the book in relation to our practice. As you'll see here, this is a small press book fair that's happening this weekend at VSW. The books have been central to our activity since our founding, and to start talking about books at VSW, I have to begin with VSW's founding director of the press. Her name's Joan Lyons. This is a page from 1972's book by Joan called Self-Impressions. It's made with a Hallowed Xerox camera and duplicator. As I mentioned, Rochester was home to Xerox. And here you can see some very early experimentation with zero-graphic or electrostatic imaging, partly because of that cultural access to technology and the research development in the region. But early on, VSW Press established a platform of feminist inquiry that continues to this day as a methodology and practice for publishing and the education platform. Feminist inquiry can be defined here as learning how things work, who is in the action, what might be possible for thinking, and thinking plus feeling or private is public out of that particularly 1970s orientation. This is interesting because you kind of jumped over the 70s, which I'm kind of filling in the 70s here in a great way, I think. Here again, you see the 1972 book. This is one of the first books published that includes Joan literally pressing her body onto the imaging plate of the Xerox camera, partly to learn how things work, to learn what's possible with the form and process. She's directly making this kind of I statement, or as in I think or I feel, and this kind of self-awareness and self-consciousness that feminist inquiry calls for concerns both thinking and feeling. As the feminist phrase from that period will really stick out, the personal is political encapsulates. The reality is that institutionalized power relations shape our most personal interactions, and artist-like lines very much challenge that dualistic opposition of public and private or intellectual and emotional. During this period, this is a book cover, a slate open book of the Dematerialization, 6 years, the Dematerialization of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972 by Lucy Lepard. This was a period when VSW Press started that was very much a time of the artist leaving the gallery or institution, particularly in the US, but other places as well, in order to create spaces of their own and to make work that weren't easily seen as commodity. Works that were conceptual, experiential, more democratic. Oftentimes what would document some of this non-object-based work were little cheaply produced books. And these would be a site of documenting performance, site-specific work like land art, works that the only material was language. So these would be easily disseminated in book form. And similarly, Joan Lyons was in league with some of this activity that moved away from institution art, away from commodified art objects. So she was interested in completely bypassing gatekeepers, particularly mainstream publishers and art exhibitors that didn't value women's stories. When she wanted to learn typography and offset printing as an art student who had graduated from Alfred State University in New York in the 1960s, she was essentially just pushed out by that predominantly male form of production at the time, and she was not allowed to participate. So she literally got a printing press of her own, and an offset printing press, not a letterpress. And it's a small A.B. Dick duplicator, is what it's called. And so she learned to make offset prints. Here you see a page from a very straightforward book. It's called Bride Book, Red to Green. And Joan wrote that in the 70s, several of my books dealt with feminist issues. For many women, an artist's book then seemed the perfect container for a passing observation or a site where a personal story could be translated into a public narrative. This book is a one-liner, she says, a somewhat tongue-in-cheek contribution to the serious and theoretical feminist practice prevalent at the time. She goes on to say that the genesis of this book was the observation that shutting the ink off on the press caused the image to gradually fade away as more sheets were ran through it. So the bride, in this case, was a found large format negative. And Joan says, she looked so immobile, so isolated, I couldn't imagine a future for this icon. The bride begins in the book as a positive image and then fades away in the center of the book and gradually reappears in the negative in a totally different color. So this notion of kind of feminist inquiry helped to establish VSW Press as with an interest in process as meaning. And this is an important visual studies methodology that the practice of a form can lead to exploration of meaning. So visual metaphor become like tropes in language, with the understanding that you can really never say anything directly. There is always a metaphor or other figures of speech in the way of direct communication. Similarly with visual process, meaning is made in part through method and material. This is another one-liner example of a little more updated version. This is called Ansel Adams' New Landscapes. If you don't know Ansel Adams, he was renowned for his landscape photography of the American Wests. And this book by a graduate student at VSW, Luke Strohsnyder, made scans of his photographs, turned them into Photoshop histograms as a kind of joke or pun on mountains and grandeur of the West. But what's interesting here is more this documentation of a total transition from analog photography to digital photography at this time in the early 2000s. Ansel Adams was renowned for a form of processing called the zone system, which allowed for many different tones of gray in an analog print, silver gelatin print of photograph. Luke is playing here on the idea of the different lights and darks in an image by giving you this new technological-based mountainous image. Another example of where process equals meaning is a more recent book. This was published last year. It's called 202-456-1111, which you probably do not know is the phone number for the U.S. White House. And this was made by an artist named Jason Lazarus. Jason has the same condition, which limits the use of his hands, as a reporter that Donald Trump made fun of in 2015 in a rally. And so what Jason did for this book was write the phone number of the White House over and again with developer fluid in the darkroom, establishing a kind of protest through gestural marks. And then the form itself is a booklet, but also this accordion piece that I'm showing you snatches of here as we go through that becomes like a very tall monument, or like a Washington Monument phallus reference to the Donald, to number 45. So this idea that the darkroom process of chemograms or photograms and the gestural work becomes very integral to this particular piece. And connected here is the idea of material and form as metaphor. And these are all kind of pedagogical points that we hit in education. The idea that the materials and form are as meaningful as equal to the subjects. This is a book by Phil Zimmerman named High Tension, and it's about the encroachment of imagery and stress relations as a result. So the more ingestion of visual ingestion of violent or detracting imagery one gets, the more stressed out one feels in this book. It is die cut to have all these spikes and strange shapes, so it actually kind of functions very much like a headspace, as you can see the author's face right on the front there. It is a kind of overwhelming experience that, again, the form, the physicality of it brings function to the work. This is a student's final thesis project by Amanda Chestnut, and it incorporates multiple book elements, including this wall of small booklets that document racist encounters that affected her from her childhood. She's a multiracial woman, and this remarkable book that is an accordion piece this is a video that shows where she literally cut her hair off and sewed it into the book. The book is called Now You Have Permission to Touch My Hair, which is a phrase that was, a constant request of African American women is to touch their hair in order to, it the work here becomes a very materially semiotic. It's not just a radical point of view, but it's also that the signified here is the violence of her physical removal of her hair as a result of these kind of racist engagements with her over time. So here again, kind of looking back a bit toward the feminist process in this case, we see the founding of the press in this feminist theory that results in publication and education that is expansive of the who can publish, and it's a publication as an art form for more people. The goal being to open up more space for participation and to create a climate where the least confident among us feels safe and welcome to speak up. There are no privileged spaces of knowledge from which anyone speaks, no matter how much one may or may not know or think that they know. And so these notions really carry through VSW books, through personal statements. These become ways of opening up space for all people to engage with these artists, authors. They also become a way in which books engage interpersonally with reader to artist or author. This is a book called My Mother's Book by Joan Lyons again, and it incorporates oral history, personal accounts of her grandmother, herself, and her mother in relation as a matrilineage as opposed to a patriarchal historical framing. And these stories certainly wouldn't be recounted or probably cared about in a larger publishing house with monetary or end result audience concerns. So that sense of feminist process opens up pathways toward collaborative process and applied learning through doing things with artists that are in residence or other students that are engaged. It opens up more space for wide-ranging narratives and inclusion, and then we see those rich possibilities of collaboration result in a lot of different ways. So in terms of opening up for participation, this is an example of a group book, a student collaborative project made directly on the printing press with Joan Lyons in the 70s. And since our founding, books had been physically involved in the curriculum as a means to interact with images. The workshop or foundation structure is such that you go through workshops in still images, interactive images, and moving images, as opposed to, say, color and material and other means like the Bauhaus would, and you're bringing your own subject matter to this material as you work through these different ways of thinking through media. And everybody does it, even if you're an art historian or a curatorial practice student of the program. The idea being that everyone learning process as a means to better understand what is happening in artworks and visual culture more generally. A more recent project that is a good example of how this collaborative process opens up opportunities for more participants in discipline is a project called Transitions Rochester, and these are images from an exhibition portion of the project. Transition Rochester was a multi-year residency for 3 photographers and researchers from the Netherlands, and then 3 artists that were located then in Rochester, as well as 2 graduate students at VSW and several other community members who participated. You probably know this, but Kodak went bankrupt in 2012, so the year after we published and produced this project. And when I first arrived in Rochester in 2003 was the same year that Kodak shed thousands of jobs. And so all these employees were losing work, and virtually every person and institution in this town was affected by Kodak. It was all, internally at Kodak, it was called Daddy Kodak, as in like the patriarch of the town. And so all the industry effects and social changes in the United States eventually make their way to Europe or touch Europe in some way, and the Dutch, who we worked with in this case, were very interested in what was happening in company towns because they were outside Utrecht, where there was a couple of company towns, and were curious what was going to happen. Of course, they're photographers for life, had been for life, so they were very interested in where film was produced and paper was produced that they've been using since the beginnings of their studies. We worked with community artists that were our graffiti writers. So you can see here a mural of Rochester in kind of its heyday, and then of course this wrecking ball. It's a little dark in the image. Sorry, this wrecking ball image that's also pictured. We made 6 books with a design firm in the Netherlands called Kummer and Herman, and they designed the project to look like a boxed set of Kodak paper. This is Oscar Palacios, Colombian-born, and an interesting point here is this is downtown Rochester, and this is the scale model relative to downtown Rochester, and that is Kodak Park. These parcels are all different regions that were eventually slowly demolished or transitioned to be other education spaces. So you can see, like, our city is literally, our downtown is about a third or maybe a half of the scale of this industrial complex that then was transformed. This is Theo Bart, the Dutch photographer. At the top, you can see him photographing from this monumental building, Kodak Tower, down to the parking lots, showing you the half-used parking lots of the business. And this gentleman here is a city worker who works to raise buildings and documents all the open lots occurring from housing and other turmoil after the economic fallout of Kodak. There's about 6,000 empty parcels of land in the city alone that are the result of houses being demolished post Kodak. This is Dutch photographer Karin Markerink. We had this ring highway in the city that kind of was set up by Kodak to get people around the city to different industrial parks, but that in effect segregated the city very much. So African American and people of color in general were locked in the downtown. All the wealth went to this kind of ring of suburbs on the outside, and Kari documented the ring highway in various elements throughout. This is the photographer Gregory Halpern doing a much more lyrical, kind of poetic documentation of the city through photographic sequence. And then Andrea Stolzen's working with, she's Dutch, working with photographers that are job workers. They're people that are out photographing in amusement parks and at bars and selling you your prints of being out partying with your friends. So she went around the city with these photographers, hence the title Reasons to Smile, as a way of kind of looking up after this economic decline. And then Juliana Muniz, one of the graduate students at VSW, is the official photographer for a group of graffiti writers, Fwa, who we incorporated into the show. And this is an example where she was the research assistant and working directly with these artists for the engaged 3-year-long coming back and forth residency, taking them to sites, getting them access as a means of photographing, and then she made her own work alongside them and learned directly from them as a result. And then her work researching on the project led her to, so I can play this video, led her to working on an ebook. It expanded into different kind of technology because she was working in video, writing, photography, needed maps and other things to be engaged for this documentation of a hustler she grew up with in her neighborhood named Boo. And the book's called Love Always Boo. And he was in prison multiple times for cocaine dealing. And she documented his life through in and out of addiction, in and out of prison. She gets him to talk about family photographs, talk about his life story in a variety of ways, and very intimately brings Boo's story to us. Now Juliana is working for the New York State Literacy Center, working with imprisoned young men to help them read and write and tell their own stories. And she's a teaching artist at an art space in the city. Part of what we're trying to do is to create visual studies critical analysis through these book works. The idea being that more participation by wide-ranging people leads to more diverse forms of cultural inquiry and critique, as well as critical analytical approaches. Here's another example of this kind of strategy. This is an artist-resident book by Clarissa Sly called Reading Dick and Jane with Me. I don't know if these were here in Europe, but in the United States, there were these Dick and Jane books that were a fixture for reading for young people. You learned how Dick and Jane ran and jumped and other things, and you learned to read as a result. But they were well-dressed white kids that were in the books. And so Clarissa, being an African-American woman, integrated, kind of forced the consciousness that there were other human beings that needed to learn how to read or could be illustrated in these works by subverting the visual culture of the children's illustrated book to make this critical study. A recent-ish graduate student, about 10 years ago now, Michael Leonard, worked with photographing the eye. Eyes are currently being used in biometric studies for surveilling people, and he did a catalog study of about 200 participants getting their eyes photographed voluntarily through his process, and then cataloged those with a sliding scale visual spectrum in the work, partly to raise consciousness about the idea that this is happening. Sorry, I got a slide out of order. That's another book of spread of Clarissa Slides. Did anybody meet Francois Deshaun when he was here as a Fulbright Fellow? I know Andrea and Thomas. He was here all last year teaching at FAMU, I believe, or 2 years ago rather, as a Fulbright Fellow. This is a book we published with him called Drone 123, and it comes in this metal case with a remote control colophon, which is just a description of what's in the book, and these 3 booklets. I have to kind of describe. So this dotted line you see on the upper right is actually a page break. That's where the page is cut, and then you flip over the page and reveal another image or another language. So when you see it first, it says drone victory, and then it says redone history. Drone being part of colonialist practice and playing off the idea of a drone bee. So here you see images of a South Pacific island pre-colonialization and then after colonialization. You see these images of colonized people with their colonizers. And then a second book in the series brings the everyday of war, forces that consciousness into the home through these images. Francois was very upset about his son playing video games long distance online, and essentially enacting drone warfare at the exact same time that drone warfare was taking over in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Iraq, and so on. So again, he sort of forced the consciousness of this work through this visual critical analysis that really brings the video game and warfare into bear and puts these 2 visual cultural signs right next to each other. I had to include this because I just saw it for the first night. The flowers are not a part of the book. This is We've Never Been Earthed by Andrea Petrova and Thomas Ruza. And I just received it last night for the first time, just saw it for the first time. It comes in this black recyclable plastic bag, and there's a map form in it, as well as a booklet that you'll see in a second. And it incorporates, we were so excited to get this proposal because it talked about personal apocalypse in the proposal. And something about that just really stuck out as we all kind of march toward ecological drift and worry, and the idea that the personal and the ecological are completely enmeshed and in turmoil right now. Part of the process, I don't have an image of it here, part of the process for Andrea and Tomasz was a kind of performance survey. They can tell you more about it in essence, but our graduate students participated in it. They are documented in the books as well. Just a few more projects here in this visual critical analysis. So this is Heidi Nielsen's Fake Snow collection. It was a book we did in 2009, where she literally compiled objects that were used for fake snow production in movies and in set design and in other means, and then made these dioramas focused on the different kinds of fake snow. Again, a kind of environmental critique, and within the book you get these physical objects that are a kind of collection of these fake snow particles. This was a part of a larger exhibition project that we worked on called EcoBooks, Environmental Consciousness in Rare and Artist Books, that I actually curated from myself, and it was a part of an exhibitions class. So the graduate students designed, I pulled together all the books, and then we discussed through class categorically how they were going to be functioning in the exhibition, and they designed the exhibition, and they created this notion of a kind of manufactured landscape reading room where everybody that saw the work would sit at this pre-cut wood picnic table on AstroTurf, which is a fake grass carpet, and they made these clouds, which I actually hated, but they made these interesting shapes graphically on the walls, some more of an ominous kind of shadows. And part of the process is giving them a leeway to determine how the work's going to be exhibited and presented to the public. They also design education talks and platforms for the work to engage the community. In terms of how we operate with this space, we have a really prominent part of our activity is decentralizing power and collections. So we have this room that has about 1 million images in it, and it provides unrestricted access for experimental approaches within it. The idea there is that artists and researchers can use materials for their work that aren't going to cost them money, and they don't have to ask permission. They don't have to worry about the uses. Here's a book called Stereographing America that incorporates 19th century stereographs with a timeline of activities in the world. So you do this work of kind of reading across the spread to understand what's happening in it historically through education materials that were publicly available, visual culture. This is a book called Two of Us by Dutch artist Elizabeth Snard, who was a student, and she really pioneered us using the materials as art. Alejandro Cartagena made a book with us last year. We commissioned this after Trump was elected. He's a Mexican photographer, and he wished to make a book about neighborliness using text from the U.S. show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and incorporating images from the collection that all show a kind of engagement with family and neighbors. This is Mexican workers that concludes the book. Finally, sequence is one of the methodologies that I think contribute greatly to the visual studies research and analysis that we developed. The founder of VSW, Nathan Lyons, would say that an image series is generally thematically related or connected, whereas a visual sequence is based on causal relationships, so cause and effect. The Latin root being to join for series and then to follow for sequence. So a sequence is several pictures that react or act upon each other, but not necessarily with the adjacent picture. That's a quote by Keith Smith. Keith is renowned as a book artist, and he actually incorporates non-objective imagery sometimes in his work. This is a book literally just of string. As you turn the pages, the sewn threads shift and change to make a dynamic visual flow. Keith would teach students often. He would say, I would tell students, copy musicians, not artists, it's less obvious. And this perhaps is a better example where you're looking at a photo book, Return Your Mind to Its Upright Position by Nathan Lyons. And Lyons saw photography in sequence on a historical continuum, starting with pictographic writing and ideographs, and how, quote, we might be able to consider the potentials of a visually linguistic system. So metaphorically, you can see this saying in language, perhaps an inner landscape through the photograph of this ladder that's going inside an alley and the tree on a billboard. There are different definitions of sequence. We recently put an exhibition out on comics and photo books and how the two incorporate different forms of sequence. This is a book by Doug Dubois called My Last Day at 17 that incorporates both comics and photo book styles together. And so all these overlapping methods not only yield books that support practice that are books as end, but they also involve the idea that kind of book thinking that will come into other forms of practice. So for instance, this is a graduate student who started the program thinking very much in terms of straight photography, but was required to make a book, and decided to cut out buildings and landscape photographs that she made because she was really interested in the engagement of this perforation that occurred in the book, partly because the reader would be touching something physical and could put their hand through the hole and so on. And she had no intention of really carrying on his book, but that notion of engagement put her into a new mindset. So what she developed later on was a more social practice bent. Here she worked with the German collective Spurs, who did an edible weeds workshop, foraging in downtown Rochester, to then make a meal from the forage materials in a table setting from found objects on the streets as they were foraging. And of course this becomes a dinner with invited guests to talk about food sources. And the whole project was called Civil Appetites, held at the Rochester Contemporary Art Center. So you can see in just a little bit of time that engagement notion that comes through book thinking really expanded her point of view from straight photography. And then just two more here. There's a couple spreads from a book by a graduate student who was really interested in physical computing and incorporated working with Arduinos and code writing to create a book that had a hard drive in the back, and it could actually affect sound as you're going through it to tell a personal narrative about her grandmother. And then lastly, I have an artist that came through the program who incorporated sound. Let me see if I can find the link here. It doesn't really matter if I can't. It's not worth it. So this is a sound piece that is written from the young man's DNA. He did scientific research on how to extract DNA, and then did a mapping of one chromosome, PST1, and then notated that into music notation. So the book practice in this case settles in on the idea of notation and giving this form of DNA writing music out to other people to then perform and practice the material as a way of engaging a wider audience. So there you are. Thank you very much for your time and racing through those images. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address. Yeah.